Okay, so get this right. The global cocaine trade, it's practically doubled in size from 2014 to 2020. And get this, the European market, it's grown by an unbelievable amount, 416% in just the last decade. We're talking billions of dollars here and tons of cocaine. It's a lot, you might be surprised, to learn just how interconnected this issue is to Europe. And that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, it's true. This isn't some far-off problem. It touches all of us, especially here in Europe.
Exactly. And to help us understand all this, we have this EU Parliamentary Research Service briefing. It's got a lot of data from the UNODC and other sources. It gives us a really good picture of what's happening. So first, the Andean region. You've probably heard of it, but I was blown away by how important this region is when it comes to cocaine production.
The scale of it is remarkable.
Colombia alone produces a massive 61% of the world's cocaine, and Peru's second, 26%, and Bolivia contributes 13%. It's almost like these countries are known for cocaine. Figure 1 in the report really shows this visually. The amount of cocaine they grow and seize there, it's crazy. It makes you think, though, why the Andean region? It can't just be geography.
No, absolutely not. When you look at the bigger picture, you can see that instability is a huge factor. Political turmoil, weak governments, and poverty. All these things create an environment where organized crime can grow.
Okay, so let's look at some specifics. This report has some stark facts. Ecuador, for example, their homicide rate has gone way up recently, making it one of the most violent places in Latin America. And then you have Bolivia. They have constant political fighting. It's almost impossible to make good drug control policies.
It's a vicious cycle. Instability leads to more drug trade, and that leads to more instability.
Yeah. So it's all connected, and it's costing a lot to try and fix. This report actually mentions something shocking. Globally, we spend more money on fighting drugs than the entire increase in the value of Colombian cocaine.
It's a crazy number. The report says we spend like $930 million globally on controlling drugs. But the increase in Colombian cocaine, which is about 600 more tons, is worth $20 billion on the market. So you have to wonder, are the things we're doing working? Or are we just spending money without fixing the real problem?
Yeah, that's definitely something we should talk about more. But first, let's talk about Europe. Remember that stat about the European cocaine market going up by 416%? That makes the EU a major player in all of this. And that's why we're focusing on what they're doing about it.
The EU is definitely a big market for cocaine. And the things they do to fight trafficking have a big impact.
And you can see how big the problem is from the numbers. In 2021, the EU seized 303 tons of cocaine, the most they've ever seized. Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and Germany are the main entry points. Huge amounts of cocaine come in through their ports. It reminds me of that big bust in Antwerp and Rotterdam back in 2023. 180 tons. Can you even imagine that much cocaine?
It's hard to picture.
Yeah.
But it shows how big of a challenge it is. And it shows how important the EU's role is. It's not just about stopping drugs. It's about keeping Europeans safe.
Right, yeah.
From the violence that often comes with this trade.
Right. And speaking of the EU's response, they seem to have a lot of different strategies they're using.
Yes, they do. And it's important to understand that these strategies have changed over time. It's not just about enforcing the law anymore. They're starting to understand that they need to address the problem in many ways, including addressing the root causes. And that means working together more.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What are some of the key things they've done?
Well, one big one is the security union strategy. This shows that they're thinking differently. They realize this isn't just an EU problem and that they need to work with the countries where the cocaine comes from.
So they know they can't fix it on their own.
Exactly. They've also launched the Roadmap to Fight Drug Trafficking and Organized Crime. It's pretty new, launched in 2023. It's all about making a plan for real action. It focuses on sharing information better, doing joint operations, and working better with international partners on legal stuff.
So they're trying to create a united front against these criminal networks.
Yes, exactly. And they're getting very specific with what they're doing. For instance, there's the European Ports Alliance. They launched it this past January. They're putting a huge amount of money, 200 million euros, into updating the equipment at ports so they can do better scans and checks at ports around the EU. They're also working on agreements to share data with Europol and some Latin American countries.
It's pretty impressive to see them doing so much. But for someone who's not a cop or a politician, why should they care about all this? How does this affect the average European?
That's a great question. The truth is, these things directly affect how easy it is to get drugs, the prices of drugs, and even how much violence we see on the streets in Europe. It's about safety and security. but also about fixing the problems that caused this trade in the first place.
It really shows how connected we all are. What happens in one continent affects the whole world.
Exactly. And speaking of being connected, we can't talk about the EU's response without talking about Sea Lake, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states.
Sea lakes. For anyone who might not know, can you explain what sea lake is and why they're so important in all this?
Sure. Sea Lake is basically the voice of Latin America and the Caribbean on the world stage.
Yeah.
And when the EU and Sea Lake work together, drug-related issues are always at the top of their list. It's a problem they both have, and it needs a solution they both work on.
How does that actually work? What are some real examples of them working together?
One big one is the 2023 EU-CELAC Summit. Both regions said they were committed to fighting organized crime in every way, showing they're united on this. And then there's EL-PAC-2.
EL-PAC-2, can you tell us more about that?
Of course. EL-PAC-2 is a program funded by the EU that's giving a lot of money, 58.8 million euros. To help Latin America fight organized crime, it focuses on building up their capacity, training, and technical assistance to help these countries make their institutions stronger and come up with better ways to respond to these challenges. It's a great example of the EU putting their money where their mouth is.
It's good to see them doing that. And investing in solutions they work on together. It shows that no single country can handle this alone.
Exactly. This is a global trade, so the response needs to be global too. And the EU-CELAC partnership is a big part of that. But we need to remember, within this partnership, each country has its own unique challenges. Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. They're all dealing with different situations.
So let's get into that. Can you give us a quick overview of what's happening in each of those countries? What are some of the things that make them different?
Okay. In Bolivia, they traditionally use coca,
Yeah.
which makes it harder to stop them from growing it. It's a big part of their culture and history. So you need to be careful how you approach it. Plus, like we talked about before, the political instability there weakens their response.
So it's not as easy as telling them to stop growing coke.
No, not at all. Then there's Colombia. The peace agreement with FARC was a good thing, but it created a power vacuum. New armed groups and gangs have taken over, so it's always changing. President Petro is trying a new approach, moving away from just focusing on enforcement towards something more holistic. It'll be interesting to see how that works out.
For sure. What about Ecuador?
Ecuador has seen a big jump in violence recently, with the port of Guayaquil becoming a major hub for trafficking. President Noboa is taking a hard line on crime. But we'll have to see if it's enough to stop the cartels.
And last but not least, Peru.
Peru is dealing with record levels of coca cultivation. And there are big concerns about their new Chancay megaport. It's going to be one of the biggest in Latin America. And people are worried it'll become a hotspot for trafficking.
Sounds like every country has its own unique problems.
Absolutely. And that's the main takeaway here. There's no one solution that fits everyone. Each country needs its own strategies, tailored to their specific situation, their challenges, and their opportunities.
It's all about finding the right balance between enforcing laws, working together, and addressing those root causes we've been talking about. Now, before we move on to talking more about the EU's strategies, I want to mention one more country, El Salvador. They've taken a very different approach to dealing with crime, a controversial one. It's almost like a real-world experiment, with President Bukele using these really drastic iron fist measures.
It's definitely caused a lot of debate.
They've seen a big drop in homicides, which is good, but it's also raised serious concerns about human rights. It makes you think. Is more security worth giving up some of our freedoms?
It's a tough question, with no easy answers. It's important to understand that this approach appeals to a lot of people in Latin America who are tired of the violence and instability. But we have to think about the long-term consequences. If you only focus on being tough and maybe ignore the root causes, you might just push the problem underground or create new problems later on.
And it's not just a theory. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken out about this. They're worried about using states of emergency as a solution for everything. They want a more balanced approach. That puts human rights first, along with security measures. And they say we have to address the social and economic issues that lead to crime in the first place.
It's a reminder that finding good solutions that last and are ethical, requires doing many things, addressing the symptoms and the root causes of these complicated problems.
We've covered a lot, from how important the Andean region is in cocaine production to the EU's changing response and the tough choices presented by approaches like El Salvador's. But we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to discuss. especially the EU's many different strategies.
Absolutely. So let's dive deeper into how they're doing things and explore how they're navigating this complex landscape. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay. So before we were talking about El Salvador and their tough approach to crime, it's really different from what the EU is doing. They're taking a much broader approach, more nuanced, I think focusing on working together and getting to the root causes, not just enforcing laws.
Yeah, it seems like the EU is looking at the bigger picture. You mentioned the security union strategy before. Can you tell us more about what that is and how it shows this new way of thinking?
Sure. The security union strategy is basically acknowledging that to really fight organized crime, especially something as big and complicated as the cocaine trade, you need a comprehensive approach, and everyone needs to work together. It's not just about what's happening inside the EU's borders. Right. It's about dealing with the whole process from where it's made to how it's moved to who's using it. And that means working closely with countries outside the EU, especially in Latin America, where a lot of this cocaine comes from.
So it's about building strong partnerships, sharing information, and coordinating efforts across borders, right?
Exactly. A good example of this is the EU's support for judicial and law enforcement cooperation in the Andean region. They're providing training, technical help, and funding to help those countries get better at investigating and prosecuting drug trafficking organizations.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem, it's about giving them the tools to handle it themselves.
Precisely. It's about finding solutions that last and recognizing that to make real change, you need to build strong institutions and support the people who are already there. And it's not just about working with governments either. The EU is also working with civil society organizations, local communities, and even former members of armed groups to create other ways for people to make a living and to help break the cycle of poverty and violence that often fuels the drug trade.
It sounds like a very thorough strategy, understanding how complex the issue is and addressing it from all sides.
It is, and it's not just focused on the Andean region. They're also working to improve cooperation with countries that are along those cocaine trafficking routes, places like West Africa and the Caribbean. The goal is to disrupt the flow of drugs, money, and weapons that keep these criminal networks going.
It really highlights how global this problem is, how connected everything is, but it also sounds incredibly complex. How do you even start to coordinate all these different groups and initiatives across so many countries?
It's a huge task, no doubt, but the EU has a number of tools and ways to do it. For example, Europol, the EU's law enforcement agency, has a really important role in making sure information is shared and that joint operations between law enforcement agencies across Europe and beyond are coordinated.
So they're like a central hub for intelligence and international collaboration.
Exactly. They're always analyzing data, looking for trends, and trying to connect the dots between different criminal networks. They also provide operational support, helping to coordinate investigations and arrests that span across borders.
I imagine they're working very closely with their counterparts in Latin America and other key regions too, right?
Absolutely. They have liaison officers in key countries, and they regularly take part in joint task forces and training programs to build trust and make those working relationships stronger. It's all about having open communication and working together.
It sounds like there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes that most people probably don't even know about, but it's clearly crucial.
It is. These efforts are essential to making any real progress against these criminal networks. They operate across borders, so the response has to as well.
So we've talked about the security union strategy, Europol's role, and the importance of international cooperation, but you also mentioned the roadmap to fight drug trafficking and organized crime before. How does that fit into this overall strategy?
The roadmap, which they adopted in 2023, is basically the EU's action plan for tackling these problems over the next few years. It builds on the security union strategy and lays out a series of concrete steps to take in 4 main areas.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first area they're focusing on?
The first is strengthening law enforcement cooperation. This means doing things like improving how they share information, making cross-border investigations more efficient, and developing new tools and technologies to track and disrupt those criminal networks.
So it's about making sure law enforcement agencies in different countries can work together smoothly and share information instantly.
Exactly. Speed is crucial in these investigations, and any delays in communication can really hurt their efforts. The second area focuses on tackling financial crime. This means going after the money laundering networks that let drug traffickers clean their profits and use that money to fund their criminal activities.
So it's about hitting them where it hurts their wallets.
Exactly. It's about following the money and dismantling the financial systems that let these criminal networks operate. The third area focuses on disrupting the supply chains. This means working with the source and transit countries to intercept drug shipments, seize assets, and shut down production facilities.
So it's about targeting every stage of the process, from the coca fields to the labs where they make the drugs to the routes they use to smuggle them.
Exactly. And the fourth and final area focuses on reducing demand. This involves a whole range of things like prevention programs, treatment services, and harm reduction strategies.
So they recognize that it's not just about stopping the supply, it's also about addressing the demand that drives the whole industry.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the complex mix of social, economic, and health factors that lead to drug use and developing strategies to address those root causes.
The roadmap definitely sounds very comprehensive, but I'm curious, how is the EU actually putting these ambitious goals into practice? What does it look like in real life?
Well, a concrete example is the European Ports Alliance, which we talked about briefly before this initiative, which they launched in January of this year, aims to improve security at ports across the EU, which, as we've discussed, are key entry points for cocaine.
Right, because once those shipments are already inside the EU, it's much harder to stop them.
It's exactly. So they're investing in new technology, improving how port authorities, customs officials, and law enforcement agencies share information, and just generally enhancing cooperation. The goal is to close those gaps in the system that traffickers take advantage of.
And they're putting a lot of money into it, too.
Yes, they are. The EU has committed 200 million euros to fund this initiative. But it's not just about ports. The EU is also working to improve security for air cargo, address the growing use of small planes and boats for smuggling, and even crack down on trafficking through postal services.
It seems like they're really trying to stay one step ahead as traffickers get more clever and find new ways to do things.
It's a constant back and forth. They have to be flexible and innovative to keep up with these changing tactics. That's why they're also investing a lot in new technology like advanced imaging systems and chemical analysis tools that can help them detect and intercept drug shipments more effectively.
It sounds like they're pulling out all the stops.
Yeah, you could say that they're doing everything they can to disrupt these networks.
So we've talked about the EU's efforts to improve law enforcement cooperation, disrupt supply chains, and reduce demand. But what about the financial side of things? How are they going after the money laundering networks that are so important to this trade?
That's a critical piece. The EU has implemented a number of rules and regulations specifically designed to fight money laundering and terrorist financing.
What do those regulations involve?
Well, they require financial institutions to do their due diligence on their customers, report any suspicious activity, and work with law enforcement agencies during investigations. It's about making it a lot harder for criminals to move money around without being detected and to clean their profits.
So it's about making the financial system more transparent and accountable, making it much riskier for these criminal organizations to operate.
Exactly. And the EU is also working to improve international cooperation in this area, sharing information and coordinating efforts with other countries to follow the money as it crosses borders. They can't do it alone.
It's good to see they're not just going after the drugs, but also trying to cut off the financial resources that keep these operations going.
It's a crucial part of any strategy that's going to work.
Yeah.
You have to address all the pieces of the puzzle.
Absolutely. It's clear that the EU is taking this issue very seriously and is committed to being a leader in the global fight against drug trafficking and organized crime. But as we've been discussing, it's an incredibly complex problem, and there are definitely obstacles they have to overcome. What are some of the biggest challenges they face in putting these ambitious strategies into action?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll discuss more after a quick break. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive looking at the global cocaine trade. We've been talking about the EU's strategies for tackling this complicated issue, but like with anything, there are always going to be challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in this case, they're pretty big ones, both within the EU itself, and we look at the global picture.
So let's start with the challenges inside the EU. What are some of the things that make it hard for them to actually put their own strategies into action?
One of the big things is that the 27 EU member states need to get even better at coordinating and working together. They've made progress for sure, but sharing information and actually doing joint operations together isn't always as smooth or as quick as it could be.
Why is that? What are some of the things that hold them back?
We have to remember different countries have different things. They focus on different laws and different amounts of resources, and sometimes those differences make it hard for them to have a truly unified and quick response.
It makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like trying to get 27 people to agree on what to eat. Everyone has their own tastes. But this is obviously way more important.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of resources fighting organized crime, especially something as big and well organized as the cocaine trade. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And people, not every member state has the same ability to contribute, and that can lead to some imbalances and tensions.
It's the classic problem. Everyone agrees something needs to be done, but then no one wants to pay for it.
Right. And it's not just about money either.
Hmm.
They also need people with special skills, analysts, investigators, forensic scientists, and so on. Getting and keeping these talented people is super important, but it's also a constant struggle.
It sounds like a tough job trying to use the resources they have as effectively as possible while also making sure everyone feels like they're contributing and getting something out of working together.
It is,
Yeah.
and that's just inside the EU. When you look at the challenges outside the EU, the things they face on the global stage, it gets even trickier.
Okay, so let's talk about those international challenges. What are some of the biggest hurdles they come across there?
Well, corruption is a huge one, and a lot of the countries where cocaine is produced or moved through organized crime has its hooks deep in the government and law enforcement agencies, even in the courts. It's really hard to build trust, get people to cooperate genuinely and make sure that any help they provide is actually used for what it's meant for.
It's sad, but I can see how it happens. These criminal networks are incredibly powerful, and in some places, they probably have more control than the actual authorities.
Exactly. And then there's the constant problem of political instability and conflict in many parts of Latin America. You have armed groups fighting social unrest and weak governments. All these things create an environment where organized crime can flourish.
It's like trying to build something solid on sand. You can't really create strong institutions or find long-term solutions in those conditions.
Absolutely. And it also makes it incredible.
It really makes you think about the human cost of this trade. It's not just about addiction and violence. It's also about how it weakens democracy and tears apart the very fabric of society in some of these places. So considering all these challenges both inside and outside the EU, is there any reason to be hopeful? Can they and their partners actually make a difference in this problem that seems almost impossible to solve?
It's a tough question, no doubt. But I think there are some reasons to be optimistic. The fact that more and more people are realizing this is a problem we all share and that we need to work together to solve it using a variety of approaches is a good sign. The EU's focus on building partnerships with Latin American countries, their work on strengthening institutions, and their investments in things like technical assistance and capacity building are all steps in the right direction.
So it's about playing the long game, understanding that there's no quick fix and that real progress is going to take time.
Right? And it's also about shifting the focus away from just trying to catch criminals and towards tackling the underlying causes of the poverty, the inequality, the lack of opportunities, and the weak governments that allow these criminal networks to grow in the first place.
It's about understanding that you can't just arrest your way out of this problem. You have to create a world where people have real options besides crime and violence.
Exactly. And while that's a huge task, it's ultimately how we're going to find a solution that lasts. It's about investing in education, healthcare, economic development, and good government. It's about creating a future where the drug trade loses its appeal because people have real hope and real opportunities.
That's a powerful thought and one worth working towards, even if it's a long and difficult road. This has been a really interesting and eye-opening deep dive into the global cocaine trade. We've covered a lot, but there's always more to learn.
There is. And this EU Parliamentary Research Service briefing we've been using is a great place to start for anyone who wants to learn more. It's full of information and insights, and it offers a balanced perspective on this complex issue.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone listening to check it out. And as you think about everything we've talked about today, here's one last question to consider. What can we each do as individuals and as citizens to address the things that contribute to this trade? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big the problem is, but even small actions, even just staying informed and engaged, can make a difference.
Well said. Every effort, no matter how small, can have a ripple effect, helping to create a more just and fair world where the appeal of the drug trade disappears and communities can truly flourish.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working towards a better world.